Hey everybody, and welcome to another lecture with Coding with Roby. And in this lecture, we are going to be going over Swagger, OpenAPI, request methods, and status codes. The OpenAPI specification, also known as the OAS, is a complete documentation on creating a universal standard on how to create and handle APIs. The way OpenAPI describes a standard is by using language agnostic interfaces which allow humans and machines to be able to easily understand what a specific service is doing without understanding the code or having to read the documentation. This overall allows a user to be able to consume and interact with an API with minimal effort. The OpenAPI document defines the schema of an API. The schema is an abstract definition of what the API should look like. Think of it as a blueprint of how data in the API should look when being created. The data format in which a JSON or YAML data format should be handled. The data types in which primitive data types are handled throughout the requests and the responses. Path, which in essence is how to handle parameters if the specific API takes any. The object itself and how objects should be handled within an API. And so much more. OpenAPI specification allows you to be able to write clean code when dealing with APIs and web services. You are able to view the OpenAPI schema as it gets auto-generated for you through FastAPI. So FastAPI generates the OpenAPI schema for you to view. If we look at the image on the right, we can see that we're using OpenAPI 3.0.2 and the info inside has a title of FastAPI with a version of 0.1.0. Within the paths, we only have one API, which can be seen as an empty string and a GET request method. The summary is first API, which we named the function this with an operation ID of first API, and attached at the end is the request method, which is GET. We can also see the status code within the response is a 200 with a description attached as a successful response. Within our application, we can view the entire OpenAPI standard by going to your project's URL followed by openapi.json. This is all to help the developer create RESTful APIs based on specific clean code and clean API standards. FastAPI comes with an interactive API documentation right out of the box. This interactive documentation is created using Swagger UI. If we visit our URL for the project followed by docs, we will get all of the APIs that are currently active within our application. Not only this, but we are able to see how the request should look, how the response should look, and you are able to call the APIs right from the documentation itself. Swagger is extremely popular and extremely powerful, and FastAPI brings this to you without you having to do anything yourself. FastAPI excels at quickly creating RESTful APIs. REST APIs use the same request methods as HTTP. It tells the server what the request wants to do that is coming in. REST APIs typically include GET, which is the read method that retrieves data, POST, which is a method that creates and submits data, PUT, which is a method that updates a resource, patch, which is a method that updates part of a resource, and lastly delete, which deletes a resource. These operations are also known as the CRUD operations, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. There are some additional request methods that we will not really be using throughout this course. These are used significantly more rarely than the CRUD operations, and these HTTP request methods include trace, which performs a message loop back to the target, options, which ascribes a communication option to the target, and lastly, connect, which creates a tunnel to the server based on the target resource. One of the most important pieces of information attached to the HTTP response is the status code. This is how a client knows if the exchange between the client and the server were successful. Status codes range from being in the 100s to the 500s, with each increment of 100 meaning something completely different. There is many different status codes that can be attached to a response, but I will be going over the high-level understanding of each 100 through 500. When in the 100 level of a status code, that means you received an informational response, which usually means the server is still processing the request. This is not a failure between the exchange. The 200 response means the exchange between the client and the server were successful. The 300 range means a redirection, which requires the client to complete further action. 400 range means client error. This could be due to many different responses, usually occurs during a syntax data, and all the format cannot be understood from the server. And lastly, there is the 500s error, which means a server error. This could be because of syntax or application failure on the server. Well, this wraps up Swagger, OpenAPI, request methods, and status code responses. And now let's jump back in the code, and I'll see you in the next video.